Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for joining us for another 1615 webinar. This is our last webinar of 2022. So we are sad about that, but we're excited about the webinars that we have coming next year. We'll be releasing that schedule here in the next few weeks, but glad you're here today to join us. My name is David Jackett. I'm the Director of Mobilization and Operations for 1615, and we're glad you joined us. So today I'm excited. This is a really great topic, and we have one of our partners with us today, Africa Inland Mission. If you're not aware of Africa Inland Mission or who they are, what they do, I highly recommend you check them out online and read up about them, reach out to Keith or this info email address. They are a phenomenal organization and we love partnering with them. Today we are going to talk about are these countries really closed? The idea, the terminology of a closed country is very common in the missions world and church world. We talk about places that are the hardest to gain access to, the hardest to reach. And so we use this terminology, closed countries. But are these countries really closed? The vast majority of unreached people groups are found in an area known as the 1040 window, as many of you are aware of. Most countries in the 1040 window are considered closed, which means people cannot enter to live and work in these countries as missionaries or church workers typically. But are these countries really closed? Closed to what? They are not closed to the gospel. Maybe they are just closed to our traditional methods of doing missions. So today we're going to talk about some creative ways that God is using to bring his people to live and proclaim in these creative access nations. So today we have Keith with us. He is a BAM and a B4T coach with Africa Inland Mission. Keith, we are so excited that you're here to share with us not only about your experience, but also what Africa Inland Mission is doing in some of these areas to bring the gospel to places that we think are closed. So Keith, are you with us?
I'm here. How's the audio? Can you hear me?
Awesome. That sounds great. I'm going to turn it over to you, brother.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And again, a shout out to David and our brothers and sisters over at 1615 for making these webinars possible and so much of the coaching and help you give churches around the world, especially here in the US. So thank you guys for what you do. We've got a lot of content that we'd like to hit in the next 40-45 minutes. We will certainly be opening up for some questions and answers, some Q&A at the end. So if any of what you're hearing prompts any questions, just let us know in chat. David will be capturing some of those and we'll try and make sure everybody gets scratched where they're itching today. What are we going to hit? Well, in a limited time, I'd like to take a quick look back and celebrate where we have come to missionally in the last couple hundred years. I would then like to take a look at where are we as we get near the end of 2022. What is the remaining task? Take a look at some creative access points. And then time allowing, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, drill a little bit down into the actual business side of that. Just what is business's mission or business for transformation? So we're going to start with some very broad strokes to bring us up to where we are today. And then we're going to spend some time really looking at some changing paradigms, changing methodology to help us finish the task. We have a lot to be thankful for. These last 200 plus years have been amazing. As we look at missions from Pentecost on, really up until the late 1700s, the gospel went to most places you could float a boat or sail a ship to. And the gospel was indeed global, but it was mostly on the coastlines. And it really wasn't until the late 1700s or even early 1800s when William Carey and others said, you know what, we need to take the gospel to the interiors. And Carrie focused on South Asia, India, Bangladesh, part of the world. The inland movement started, really accelerating. You have Hudson Taylor in the 1860s with his passion for China, and he created China Inland Mission that really brought the gospel into the interior in Asia. 1883, we have Sudan Interior Mission, now known as SIM, and they had a heart at that time for Africa, and they entered the interior of Africa from the west. A couple years later, 1895, you have Africa Inland Mission, Peter Cameron Scott, and he had a passion to bring the gospel into the interior of Africa from the east coast, from Mombasa, in what's now Kenya. Let's celebrate that. This was going on while colonization was going on, and that wasn't always a pretty thing, but we do have to recognize it made it possible for people that love Jesus to enter into parts of the world and not just be allowed, but in many times, many cases, they were invited. These were the years when you could get into the interiors on a church worker visa or a mission visa. And you know what? Places 100 years ago that were unreached, even 50 years ago, so many places that were considered unreached are now sending missionaries. That's exciting. As we look at South America and Central America, we look right now, so many of our teams were partnering with our Latino brothers and sisters from places like Brazil and Argentina and Central America, many other countries there. We rejoice in that. These are now sending regions, sending countries. As we look at places like Korea, my goodness, we have so many Koreans and missionaries from Hong Kong and Philippines on our teams with us. We're partnering, collaborating with them. And even really exciting to us with Africa Inland Mission to see sub-Saharan Black Africa as sending regions, countries. Yes, of course, there's still some unreached people there, but now we're partnering with Nigerians and with Kenyans and with Tanzanians and with Ethiopians on teams together as we're looking to how we can better reach the remaining unreached people groups in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, that brings us to today. We're celebrating nearly 200 years of a very, very successful paradigm. It is not used up. It has been well used, but we'll be using the current traditional look of missions for decades to come yet. As we look to finish the job or finish the job in countries that we can enter as missionaries, we really have to look at where is the remaining task primarily. And setting the stage for that, many of you already know the term unreached people groups or people groups. There's roughly 17,000 people groups in the world, tribes, call them what you will. That I used to say it was 7.8 billion people, and then somebody reminded me this week, this month, the globe will go over the 8 billion people mark. So yeah, right about now, our globe, our planet, our world is going to contain 8 billion plus people. In those 17,000 people groups, there are roughly 6,800, the way we count them. God knows for sure. I don't think any of us know for sure. But there's still roughly 6,800 UPGs, unreached people groups. And those really contain about 40% of the current world population. There are, of the 8 billion people in the world, there are still about 3.2 billion unreached people. Again, for the number of people, just try and grasp this. Of the 50 largest UPGs, that totals about 1.5 billion people in the world. Each of those groups have more than 10 million people. So again, 50 of the largest UPGs contain a billion and a half people. 47 of those 50 largest unreached people groups are in creative access or restricted access nations, parts of the world that you will not issue mission visas. They will not issue church worker visas. So clearly, most of the remaining task is going to be in these creative access nations, these CANs. Roughly, if you don't remember anything else from this webinar, leave with the knowledge that about 90% of the world's remaining unreached people, not people groups, but 90% of the world's unreached people live in creative access nations. Now, the fact that we can't get mission visas there does not exempt us from the Great Commission. It does mean we might need to change our methodology, maybe look into some new paradigms, but these countries, as David said in the intro, they're not closed to the gospel. What are they closed to? They're really closed to our more traditional methods of doing missions. So if the remaining task is primarily in CANs, in these creative access nations, we need to get creative, hence the term. And my wife and I, for 20 plus years now, have been can openers. That's primarily what we've been doing with Africa Inland Mission and many, many dozens and dozens of other organizations that we collaborate with. Yeah, I'd like to take a quick look at scripture. People that are working in creative access nations often end up planting themselves in Matthew 10. Matthew 10 is kind of a difficult chapter because so many verses in there are difficult. I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, brothers betraying brothers, and enmity between sons and fathers and moms and daughters. And one of those verses is after Jesus sent out the 12, for the first time, probably the world's first short-term mission trip, he sent out the disciples. He names them again. We already know who they are. Why does he name them again? Probably, I look at it as a recommissioning. They have been disciples. They continue to be disciples, but they are now being sent out almost as apostles into the area around them to proclaim. And it was a test of faith. What can we learn in the first 15 verses in Matthew 10? Trust me, I've got this covered. Go out, proclaim, and trust me. Well, in verse 16, the short-term mission trip kind of comes to a conclusion, and Jesus talks about missions into the future, into the centuries. And he starts out by saying, I'm sending you out as sheep among the wolves. So be wise, some versions say shrewd, as serpents, and innocent as doves. That verse doesn't say I'm sending you out as sheep to the wolves, but I'm sending you out as sheep among the wolves. So therefore, be shrewd, be creative, figure out ways to get in there, but be innocent as doves. Don't ever lose your integrity. And again, as I look back at 40 plus years being missional and working in various parts of the world, mostly Africa, I think missionaries and those sent do a pretty good job on the integrity side. I'm not sure we've always been as creative, shrewd, and wise as we could be when it comes to bringing the gospel into some of these places. So if we can't legally send out missionaries to countries that don't permit missions, what do? Well, one way, and I'm going to look at 5 ways that we have found that have worked very, very good for Africa Inland Mission and many, many other organizations. We do need to send people that know and love Jesus, but oftentimes we send them bivocationally. They need to go as something other than a missionary. And for sake of definition, I used to think bivocational meant you sent people out and they were half of one thing and half of another thing. That is actually not what it is. Bivocationally, in this context, really means that we're sending people with professions or businesses to live and work in Creative Access Nations. They are full-time in their professions and full-time proclaimers. So it's not a half and half. Doctors aren't doctors half-time. Their identity is going to be medical professionals, nurses, doctors, lab techs, radiologists, educators that teach in schools and university. They don't stop being professors and lecturers when they're not there. Their identity is what they do. Similarly, business needs to be real business. So as we send people into areas, to nations, to regions where you are not really allowed to be missionaries, interestingly enough, they are loved and appreciated as being ethical, moral, biblical professionals, engineers, medicine, education, business. Now, clearly, in Creative Access Nation, in these cans, there's not very many that are going to allow us to preach in the marketplaces. There's not very many that are going to allow us to show the Jesus film in public places. And there's not very many that encourage us or allow us to hand out tracts, Bibles, CDs, DVDs. But there are certainly many, many, many other ways to proclaim. What will these countries allow? It really totally depends on the context. And to have an understanding of the local context is really critical to proclaiming effectively. A few examples in this 1040 window and in the remaining Creative Access nations, there are certainly nations that are more strict, more devout than others. I look at places like Saudi Arabia, most of the Arabian Peninsula, places like Pakistan, North Africa, places like Libya are very strict and people are watched very closely. There are more moderate countries, and there are places like Jordan, like Turkey, Tunisia in the past. You're going to be able to do more in some countries as far as overt proclamation than you do in others. We like to land on boldness with sensitivity. We never hide the fact that we love Jesus. In fact, many, even most of our people, when they're asked, why in the world would you work here? Why, as Westerners, why would you work in Libya? Why would you work in, the Emirates? Why would you choose to work in some of these more difficult places? And it's okay to say, you know what, that's a great question. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think my God, my Savior, asked me to. So I could be a doctor anywhere. I could be an educator anywhere. But God has put a love for this country and those people on my heart, and that's why I'm there. And that is generally extremely well received because these countries are full of devout people. They're following false religions, they're following false gods, but most of them are devout and they appreciate devout people. So again, although we are not allowed in as missionaries, we certainly can be proclaiming in the workplace, in the hospitals, in universities, to a point in ways that is allowed, but we can also do it in the coffee shops, in the parks, on the beaches, in our homes. It's a 24/7 proclamation through both actions and our lips. New book just out. I just got it. I haven't even read it, but it was written by a friend of mine, Larry Sharp, called Missions Disrupted. I can't plug it because I haven't read it, but I've heard from others that have read it. It's awesome. And the subtitle is from professional missionaries to missional professionals. And I thought that's pretty profound, because really, as we move forward into these creative access areas, that's often what will happen. People will need to move from being professional missionaries to being missional professionals. So you heard it first here. If you haven't got your hands on that book yet, it's probably worth a read. And Larry owes me for a plug. All right, so how do we enter in? And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly for sake of time, but 5 ways that has worked well for us to bring people that love Jesus and want to see him proclaimed into these countries. Number 1 is the for-profit arena. To bring people in as business people can look a lot of different ways. We're going to unpack that a little bit further into the webinar, but let's recognize a really important way is to bring ethical, moral, biblical business people into areas where, to be honest, you might be the only ethical, moral, biblical business person your host culture has ever met. Globally, business people are generally not considered as the most ethical, and it is a powerful tool when you can work inside ethical business. The second one is the not-for-profit arena, and not every place is okay for business. There are some places in the world that we actually still, for reasons of volatility and depending on the people group and the area, sometimes we find that a not-for-profit entity works better. And what does this mean? Things like NGOs, non-governmental organizations, development organizations, relief sometimes. We have found long-term development actually works really well. And it's usually done in the most needy parts of the world, the places that welcomes people in as ethical, moral development. One thing we've learned, a little tip that we learned the hard way, most of these hard places are incredibly adept of eating any assets, equipment, money you bring in. Because of corruption, because of greed, it is not unusual that well-intentioned health projects, water and sanitation, well drink, medicine, it is amazing how fast hundreds of thousands of dollars can be used up. And sadly, when the money is gone, when the resources are gone, many of these people are not tolerated anymore. Little hint that we learned is, you know what, you can do a lot of development as staffing organizations to start entities that enter these countries and say, what are your greatest needs? Can we provide you trainers? Can we provide you medical expertise in your hospitals? Surgeons, doctors, but always in a training capacity. What about your schools? Can we help you out in your universities, in your secondary schools? Can we help train there? So again, when you bring people in, it's going to be relational. We generally shy away from programs and projects because they're costly and they're usually limited in time. But in some of the hardest parts of the world, we have had people working in teams for more than 2 decades because they offer their skill set, they offer their expertise, and in that, they share their lives. So we love relational long-term development, particularly as staffing organizations. So number 1, again, is the for-profit arena, businesses. Number 2 is the not-for-profit arena, again, NGOs, development relief. There's a third way that we bring people in, and this is probably among the most creative. Sometimes you can bring people in and you don't need to set up anything. You don't need to set up a business or a development organization. An example, I was actually in a 100% Sunni Muslim country some years ago. It wasn't a very large country. They were very remote, and I was there. They were experiencing a crisis, and I was able to get in when people were handing out blankets and pots and pans and bottled water, and I was able to get in and make some friends, one of which ended up being the minister of youth and sports. I didn't even know that country had a minister of youth and sports, but while we were sharing some tea and some food, we started talking, and I said, just out of curiosity, why is it your country has never ever fielded an Olympic athlete? And he laughed and said, look, it's not a very big country, and we're not that skilled, and there's not millions and millions of people in this country. And I said, well, why don't we do something about it? You want to start an Olympic committee? And short story is they ended up starting an Olympic committee with help from one of my friends that happens to work in that area. That led to another thing. Where are our athletes? And it came to the fact that this entire country had no physical education program. They didn't teach it in their schools. They had madrasa. They taught what it is to be Muslim and Islamic events, but no phys ed. And through a course of events, they said, can you help us do that? And I said, what would that look like? Well, do you have anyone that can write curriculum for us? We probably need physical education in our schools. And we actually had an individual with a degree in phys ed and also had an MBA. And they were working in another Muslim area. And when we approached this individual and how would you like to write some curriculum in this particular country? Their answer was, I would love to, but you can't get into that country. That's one of the hardest countries on the planet to get into. I said, well, you know what? I think we have an invite. So here we have one of the most closed countries on earth offering an open, believing lover of Jesus into their education department, a few doors down from the Minister of Education, and this person was paid to come in for a one-year contract to write curriculum for a Muslim country. That contract turned into a second year, a third year, a fourth year, and a fifth year. And the country that was so closed you couldn't get in paid our individual to be there and paid for their apartment and paid for them to visit all those different areas that you can't get access to. We didn't need a business. We didn't need an organization. We just needed the right person at the right time. So sometimes that means being the headmaster or headmistress of a school. Sometimes it's helping out in education. Sometimes it's in medicine. But you don't always need to set something up if you can creatively find a need and God provides the right Jesus-loving person that can fill that need. So again, quick review. How do we get into creative access areas? Number one, for-profit arena. Number two, the not-for-profit arena. Number three, professional placement. Number four, and it took us a few years to recognize this, but surprisingly, you can bring a lot of really, really good people in as retirees. In much of the creative access world, they allow people to come in and retire. In the US, we have the Caribbean, we have Florida, we have Hawaii. Europe has kind of priced out coastal Spain and southern France a long time ago. So it's amazing how many Europeans, how many Asians take vacations, live part of the year, or retire to places on the Mediterranean coast, or the Red Sea corridor, or the Arabian Peninsula. or places in the Far East, in places like Thailand and places there. So again, you don't need to do anything if you're of an age, and a lot of them don't actually state an age, but we generally figure if you're 50 or older and you can show the government that you have an income stream and you're not going to be a drain on their country, they welcome you as long as you don't work, because they love what you bring and they love your money. So in many areas, some of our best team leaders are people with tremendous life experiences, many of which have all the time they need to learn language, make friends, drink coffee in the shops, go mountain biking, go surf fishing, and make friends for Jesus. So yeah, retirees is often overlooked and is often one of the easier ways to bring wonderful individuals and couples into these places. Last one of the 5 that we have used is students. And this is generally not a long-term solution, but it's a wonderful way to bring people in to make friends, learn language, learn culture, and often while they're there as students in universities, they're making friends that open up other opportunities once they're graduated. So many of our students that get into these countries for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes to get a master's degree, sometimes PhDs, often end up returning either in the for-profit or the not-for-profit or even the professional placement sectors. So again, I'm sure there's going to be a 6th and a 7th, and if any of you have other ways that you have found that work to bring people into these creative access nations, by all means, let me know. But right now, we have landed on 5 that we know work: for-profit, not-for-profit, professional placement, retirees, and students. Okay, in the remaining time, I would really like to take a look a little bit more at business, because that certainly has been one that has served us very well. And as we look at value and effectiveness, God has really used kingdom businesses to advance his kingdom. First of all, as far as terminology goes, you see things referred to as BAM, business as mission, or missional business. Again, more and more you're seeing reference to B4T, that's business for transformation. And again, part of this is we have to talk about theology. What isn't this? Please don't think as BAM or B4T as 9 to 5 with a little ministry sprinkled around the edges. Again, as we've already discussed, we love to build kingdom businesses that are the springboard. They are the launch pad. That is where our ministry starts, with our employees, with our vendors, with our customers, with drivers, with hotels. It is not something just to get a visa, and we call that B4V, business for visa. Most of the time, individuals do B4V. It is really not a viable business. It's a shelf company. It's something that does just enough activity to allow me into the country, and we generally do not embrace that. So again, our theology as we work in the business world is to make sure our businesses are relational. We like to say there are job takers, job makers, and job fakers. We do not like job fakers, and we prefer not to be job takers. We don't want to take jobs that people within our host culture can do, so we prefer to be job makers. And that can help with poverty alleviation and bringing people respect and bringing them honor in an honor-shame society. So again, to build missional, kingdom-minded business is a very, very powerful tool. In the business as mission world, it's pretty broad, and I'm just going to introduce you quite quickly to some terminology that was actually developed about 15 years ago by Patrick Lai. Patrick wrote a book called Tent Making, The Life and Work of Business as Mission. Good book. It's 15 years old. I think it first came out in 2005. At the time, it really helped create definitions and define what the task was. Patrick is still very, very involved in the B4T movement and the open network. And we're very thankful to Patrick and so much of what he's done to help and get this train and keep this train on the tracks. So yeah, what I'm going to be referring to in the next few minutes, I'm actually borrowing from Patrick's book, but it does help us understand how business as mission works. There is, like in so much of missions, guess what? We have a scale. It's not a C scale, it's not an H scale, but in the business world, we have a T scale, and we have a T1 through T5. I'm just going to touch it really quick. You don't need to understand this intimately, but please recognize the differentiations created. A T1 tent maker or business person is actually a person that is a Christian, loves Jesus, is working in a business, is working in a company, a corporation, and one day his business approaches them and say, hey, we would like to know if you'd be interested in working in another part of the world. For example, we have someone working for one of the big oil companies. Might be Shell, Exxon, might be BP, and you're working in the States or you're working in Europe, and they say, hey, how would you like to move to the Arabian Peninsula, one of the Emirates or Saudi Arabia? And he says, you know what? That's pretty cool, because most of those places are unreached. I'm going to have a chance to impact people as a lover of Jesus in the workplace and out of the workplace. So this person goes and might be the only believing person that his friends and his coworkers have a chance to know. He's probably, or he or she is probably living on a compound. They probably don't control their time, the company does. But you know what? They do, within reason, can have some faith in and out of the workplace. And we know from experience and from research that God has used T1 tent makers to bring unreached people into the kingdom. That's exciting. It's a pretty small percentage of the BAM world overall, and the results really are limited, but they're there. As you move up the scale, we refer to some people as T2 workers, and the big difference between a T1 and a T2 is really intentionality. A T2 worker just doesn't happen to be approached by his company, by his corporation. A T2 worker intentionally goes and prepares. I want to have an occupation. I'm going to go get trained as a petro engineer so that I can go in to the Arab world. And you know what? I'm going to study Arabic. And you know what? I'm going to have some missional training. And I'm going to research, and I'm going to do everything I can to get placed in a position and in a place where I can let my light shine. So obviously, T2 workers, as you can imagine, are going to be a little bit more effective and have a little bit more to show than T1s, because they're better trained, they're better prepared, and they're generally more intentional. One very cool thing has happened in the T2 world, as I see it. Back a few years ago, a friend of mine, Andrew Scott, who's actually the U.S. Director of Operation Mobilization, OM, he wrote a book called Scatter. And it's a cool book. Again, if you haven't read it, read it. What's the premise? Go there into all the world and take your job with you. And again, it takes him a few more pages of that to unpack it, but Andrew takes a good look at what our biblical mandate is, and his book Scatter was actually used to help create another entity called Scatter Global. And the premise is, why are there literally tens of thousands of secular jobs in the 1040 window in the creative access world, and the secular world is very good at taking them all? Why are people in America and in Europe sitting in the pews? Why are accountants and engineers and medical professionals, why are they not taking positions that are offered and open and available to them, and they can go in as Christians? So again, in this T2 world, we now have this entity. You can find it online. It's called Scatter Global. And what it actually does is to take people that love Jesus and try to place them in occupations where they can be hired on as valued workers. T3s are basically, let's go and create a kingdom business where we control where we live, we control how many hours we put in, we control who we hire. And as you can imagine, T3 historically over the last 2-3 decades has really been the sweet spot for us and a lot of other organizations. When you intentionally create a job, you start a business with a business plan and a plan for church planting or disciple making within the business, it's a powerful, powerful thing. So T3 workers are generally those working in viable businesses, profitable businesses that were created to have a good business and a good outreach. T4 is similar to what we talked about previously. It's the not-for-profit sector. Believe it or not, NGOs and relief and development, they are businesses. They're just not profit sharing and profit business. So the T4 sector is basically people that are working within organizations, and again, some of which we know, we always have our SAM purses and our world concerns and our world visions, and many, many, many smaller ones with more specific focuses. But those workers we call the T4 workers. And T5 is basically what we would call people that would start a business, but really without intent of profitability. We don't encourage this. T5 workers, we are seeing less and less and less of that. I think that overall is a good thing, because there are some integrity issues that you have to wrap your head around if you're going to do that. So T5 is kind of on its way out, although to be honest, there are definitely people working creative access that are working in companies that do not show the profit that you would expect. Okay, I'm watching our time go by. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly, but I would like to mention another resource to you all. We've talked about integrity and identity. It's critical. When we go in, as in Matthew 10:16, we need to be innocent as doves. We need to be people of integrity. We also need to know what our identity is. Our identity needs to be Jesus believing, Jesus loving individuals with a profession. There is something that was made to help workers do this. And again, I'm referring to a tool known as BAM 360. And you can find that on a BAM 360 website. I think you'll see it on a slide. It basically helps people working and living in creative access nations to recognize you have at least 3 very specific identities. You have a professional identity, you have a cultural identity, and you have your spiritual identity. And BAM 360 actually has a really, really good workbook that individuals, couples, teams can use to help them process through a series of questions. It actually encourages you in very short 2 or 3 page chapters. It brings up issues within your professional identity, like integrity, like how can you bless locals? What about work ethics? What about profitability and sustainability? And then as it goes into your cultural awareness, how are you going to deal with gender appropriateness, respectable dress, language learning? What are the parts of your culture are you going to embrace? What do you need to be careful of? What's the cultural view of work? And then it will guide you into some questions in your spirituality. How are you going to deal with the verbal side of proclamation? How are you going to pray? How are you going to use testimonies and stories? So again, just to make people aware, there are tools that exist now that did not exist 10 years ago that have really, really helped so many people as we move more and more proclaimers into the creative access world. I'm going to need to wrap up there. One last thing, just because I know people always wonder and ask, when we create businesses, what kind of businesses do we create? And again, it will inevitably come back to context. What context are we working in, and what's the gift set of the people God is calling there? So we have, in the last 20 plus years, just within my organization, we have been involved in setting up and establishing tourism businesses, language services, sometimes schools, real estate businesses. We've used fitness. CrossFit is a powerful, powerful tool, and it's global. Christian gyms are a powerful thing. We've done printed apparel and silk screening, some small scale manufacturing in that area. Photography, videography can be very powerful. We have marketing and consulting. We've done management and leadership coaching. 3D printing, believe it or not, can be a tool. Various trilingual sort of education, even things like risk assessment. So everything from music to fitness to real estate, God can use it all. So again, let's recognize God calls very special people into very special places. And with the right creativity and preparation, we believe that God can use pretty much any and all of that. So David, I'm going to turn this back over to you. Again, hopefully we've left some time for some Q&A. And yeah, thank all of you who are listening in. And it's been a blessing to share with you all today.
Yeah, Keith, wow, that was really, really good. One of the things that just kept coming to mind as you were going through that, and I know this to be true about Africa Inland Mission, just as I've partnered with them over the years. I just love the intentionality behind each one of those layers. When you were talking about the difference between business's mission and B for T, and even the B for V, I think we've seen that a lot. I think that there are a lot of well-intentioned organizations and efforts out there, but I just don't always see the intentionality and the really I think intentional is the right word, that there's not a one size fits all. I even love that you phrase that like this is a very strategic way to start thinking about closed countries, but this doesn't work in every context, nor should it work in every context. So all that to say, just all those layers and all those angles, I just really appreciate what you had to say, Keith, and the intentionality behind what Africa Inland Mission does in these different areas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, David.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question. Dave asks, when we were talking about the 5 points of creative access, he said, are job takers the same as professional placement options? So you made a distinction there, or you used both of those terminologies, but he's asking are those the same, or maybe you can point out the differences there?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. There is a very significant difference. In professional placement, we are placing personnel into positions where there are no locals with the capacity to do that. So even in something like Scatter Global, or when we place people into key positions, the reasons that those are available is the fact that they don't have capable people within the host culture to take that. So that's a very good distinction, and we would never want to go take a position that a local could. In fact, even when we put doctors, educators, we always do it in a training capacity. We would love to work ourselves out of a job so we can go take another position to train up others.
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks for that distinction, Keith. I love that idea. One of the things we did and we tried at our church that was different was, rather than doing some of the more traditional short-term stuff, we had people who were professionally trained. So I'm a retired firefighter, and one of the things a lot of firefighters really struggled with was, how does my gifting serve a kind of a traditional missions model? How can I just go into these communities? I don't really have some of these skill sets. I'm a firefighter, you know, that's what I do. And so we began to take firefighters into countries to work alongside the local government and provide some training, but we also didn't want it to appear like, oh, we're the American firefighters, so we know all and we do it the best. But it really began to provide some really great opportunities because we shared a common bond. We took the same oath to put our lives on the line for the community. So it led to gospel conversations very, very quickly, more quickly than I've ever seen in a short-term context. But that was an opportunity for us as a professional to kind of come in and kind of provide kind of a training / partnership opportunity.
Excellent. Maybe just a quick little add-on there, David. I didn't mention it. I probably should have. One of the most desirable things in the world today is to speak English. It almost goes without saying. Throughout the 1040 window, the world, partially because of internet, partially because of banking, aviation, there are most of the remaining 1040 window has a huge desire to speak English. There will be, for the foreseeable future, into decades, I'm sure, mother tongue English speakers with a 4-year college degree and a teaching certificate, preferably CELTA. There's other TESOL courses, but globally, the gold standard is the CELTA certificate. That's the Cambridge English Language Training Assessment. Again, as Americans, we're pretty American-centric, and we think the world wants to speak American. Actually, globally, English, the people kind of figure it comes from England. So again, a CELTA certificate is pretty hard work, but most people can get it in a month or less. And again, if you are a mother tongue English speaker with a 4-year degree in a CELTA certificate, it can be your ticket to virtually anywhere. And it's a marvelous, marvelous tool. It's a great arrow in everybody's quiver.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Albert asks, is there a platform where retirees can meet, say by Zoom or some other platform, to discuss the effectiveness of living in a closed country where God can use us to communicate our faith?
Great question, and I don't know of anything that's been created yet. Great question. It probably should be. What I can offer, if there are those listening that would be interested in learning more about that, we can certainly put you in touch with people that either currently are or have worked in creative access. I shouldn't say work, I should say live in creative access nations as retirees.
Yeah, that's good. I know that sometimes a lot of those things just happen organically, and so that can sometimes, that's a great thing, but it also is a difficult thing as well. So we have another question here. Someone says, love the T-scale, but I wasn't quite sure what trait was scaling. In other words, as you go from T1 to T5, what trait of tip making is either decreasing or increasing?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question again. I didn't create the scale. I'd have to ask Patrick for that. But what we're sensing now, 15 years after that was created, is I think intentionality and strategic value. Again, T1 is almost circumstantial. People are finding themselves working abroad. T2 certainly adds intentionality, but I don't really want to start a business. I want somebody to employ me. And T3 and T4 are actually going all in. I have to learn language. I have to learn culture. And I'm going to need to bring capital and other assets to the table to do that, whether that's in the for-profit arena or in the not-for-profit NGO. T5, actually, probably we could write out, except we do have to acknowledge that it still goes on. So I'm not sure that scales anything. I appreciate the question. Hopefully, I brought some clarity. Yeah, I have to think more about that. It's a very, very good question.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully that helps clarify a little bit. Yeah, we've had some great questions. We've got a lot of people that have said they're interested in learning more about kind of a community of people that are maybe in the retirees. So what we'll do is we have an email that'll go out after this. If you're interested, there's a survey. Actually, this is for everyone. There's a short survey that is at the end of every webinar. We would be really thankful if you'd fill that out. That helps us kind of scale how we're doing. It also gives you an opportunity to put in what are some webinar topics that you would like to hear about in the future. And so we follow up on all those. So if you're interested in that information, please definitely fill that survey out at the end of the webinar, and we'll make sure to get back in touch with you. If you're requesting more information from Africa Inland Mission, I'll make sure to pass those requests on and get those to the right people over at Africa Inland Mission as well. It looks like that's all the questions we have. Most of the ones we have coming in now are interested in learning more about those 5 key access points. Keith, this has been really, really great. I mean, I know this one's been on the calendar for a while for us. Really, really appreciate all the effort you put in and just the great information you shared. We're so excited to partner with Africa Inland Mission. For those of you listening in, this webinar is being recorded. It will also be posted on our YouTube channel within the next 7 to 10 days. If you haven't followed our YouTube channel, highly recommend you do that. We have hundreds of videos covering all sorts of missions topics, from missionary care, our Mobilizing People of Color webinar series, how to get your leadership in your church more active and engaged in global missions. That is often one of the most common questions we get asked when we travel and speak. But you can find that at our website, 1615.org, or you can go directly to YouTube, youtube.com/1615, all spelled out. So Keith, any final words before we close it out today?
Yeah, just a special thanks again to 1615 to make this all possible. One thing worth mentioning, if people want more information, reach out and contact me either through Africa Inland Mission or 1615. But there are events right now. If people want to know more, there is at least one every year in the States where it's a 2.5-day event, and there are practitioners there from around the world. There are B4T, BAM coach and mentors. There are churches there looking to know how to get involved. And more, there are universities and colleges who want to, especially in the Christian Coalition, to learn, how do we teach this? How do we build this into our business curriculums. So again, there are in-person events that if people have enough of an interest, I'm more than happy in sharing the details of those if that sounds interesting to anyone. Thanks, David.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We're excited to see you guys next year. We will not have a webinar next month or in January, but starting in February, we will be kicking the year off with our new webinar lineup. Keep up to date. Either follow us on social media, or you can go to our website, 1615.org/events, to keep track of those events and more coming up. So thanks so much and have a good one.